Hi everyone, myself and Ruth Houghton are today talking about utopias, colonialism and international law. So I'm Aoife, I'm at Durham University Law School and I examine governance wherever it happens. We focus on feminism and at the moment tyranny. Also do quite a bit of law and literature, including work on personification.
And hi, I'm Ruth Houghton. I'm based at Newcastle University in the law school. My research is on critiques of global constitutionalism. I look at the discourse on democracy, but have a particular focus on feminist approaches to global constitutionalism and currently using law and literature to engage with ideas of constitutionalism. So I'll introduce the project. This project investigates the relationship amongst three features of the modern era that continue to reverberate and penetrate people's lives. They are utopian literature, the colonial project, and international law. We argue that utopias that inspired, relied upon as political tracks, and remain invoked and sometimes ridiculed were Western, patriarchal, racist, and misogynist. And they were influential in colonialism, imperialism, and critically for us in international law. What we're interested in looking at is those utopian texts that are non-white Western, that are feminist, queer, or indigenous. They are rarely acknowledged by international law, and even when they are, they're tied with the same idea of being ridiculed and not really investigated for their content or political aims. So for this project, we've broken down utopias and utopianism into kind of 5 broad categories. The apocryphal, those are those utopias that are often ignored or dismissed. Secondly, the canonical, what we're calling our kind of Western patriarchal utopias. The third is the canonical international law, those world-building projects and those international lawyers that sought to build them. Fourth, an apocryphal international law, such as events as Bandung or the new international economic order. And fifthly, the canonical utopian international law events, congresses, such as Versailles, that are seen as utopian moments. So what's the background to all of this? Well, over the past several years, we've been working on utopias, feminism, and global constitutionalism. And our recently published article, Our World, A Feminist Approach to Global Constitutionalism, which has now been published in Global Constitutionalism, examines the lessons to be learned from feminist science fiction utopias. We argued that global constitutionalism, which is a disciplinary project that at its core looks to improve the legitimacy of international law and governance, is in many ways utopian, but one that has not taken seriously feminist critiques of both constitutionalism and international law. And that led us to then question, well, global constitutionalism, better for whom? While utopias written by men are often considered as serious political interventions, those offered by women are rarely regarded as such, and they're dismissed as being unworthy of academic engagement. Feminist science fiction utopias often eschew the blueprint utopias, those that offer plans or specific models or destinations or end goals. You rarely find those within feminist science fiction texts. Those feminist science fictions will subvert gender relations. They're not reliant on forefathers to grant them ideal, indefinite constitutions, and they ask questions about the nature of the right to revolt and questions of the idea of home. So we took seriously the role of women's texts as political interventions, because alongside our work on utopias, we're also working with feminist manifestos, and we look at their role as legal and political performative texts. In our previous work then, we've used Le Guin, Jameson, Perkins-Gilman, Percy and Alderman, amongst others, to consider what ideas of feminist constituent power might be. However, we're very aware that by focusing on science fiction, we were working with a genre where women, especially Black women, women of colour and non-white Western voices are traditionally absent. This is true for what is studied and then utilised as utopian literature, and you can see the emergence of canonical ideas of utopian literature. We use as an example John Carey's Fabian Book of Utopias, which is a pretty good place to start if you're looking for both white liberal male utopias and the way in which other apocryphal utopias are overlooked. This constructed absence is, of course, almost true for scholars of constitutionalism and international law beyond specific jurisdictional or research areas. And previously, we've also critiqued Western white feminist utopias in science fiction, again, asking that question of better for whom. We also identified in our previous work where those silences within the literature have been constructed so that voices aren't heard. And we chose not to represent others, but rather to call upon the scholarship to stay silent so that those other voices could be properly listened to. So in this project, Colonialism, International Law, and Utopia, we had two objectives. Firstly, how white Western patriarchal utopian projects, what we call the canonical, have influenced and were influenced by law, the state, and international law. And secondly, what we can learn from the apocryphal utopias, those that have been overlooked or hidden. And amongst these then, we will be considering those different criteria, breaking it down into the lawyers themselves as utopian world builders, the apocryphal utopias and events that have been dismissed, and then utopian events that are celebrated, often by the world building lawyers, and what this can teach us about international law. Why utopias? Well, utopias are often dismissed as being unprofessional. Utopia and utopianism is dismissed as dangerous, impossible, unfeasible, and unrealizable. And this causes two problems. Firstly, that critique is predicated on a small subset of utopian literature. And secondly, the act of dismissing them ignores their powerful influence. So in dismissing utopias as dangerous and unfeasible, that's problematic because it repeats the similar errors of before. We're only looking at white male Western genre, the canon, as the sum total of what has been said in utopian literature. And to dismiss utopian literature in that way is to then ignore its influence. So let us take the apparent root of many white patriarchal Western utopias, the Judeo-Christian ideal of founding Eden or the New Jerusalem. One's impossible, the other not. The latter is the site of religious wars, for example, the Crusades, and the other is a more modern imperial project, America. These are utopian projects that are not dismissed, but rather were and are influential. So we join the critique of the canonical utopianism and bring it to bear on international law. In this project, the canon is not treated as the sum total of utopianism. They were bad and are bad, but that does not follow that is true of all utopianism literature, or that the political need for utopianism is not unnecessary. So here we want to look at the wide breadth of utopias. We examine the canon and its emergence during the time of the age of colonialism. Indeed, it's no accident that Thomas More's Utopia is set on an island where the indigenous population is murdered and enslaved to create the utopia. We want to examine the real harm that this canonical utopian literature has helped to perpetuate and continues to perpetuate. But we also reclaim utopia. What other political values can be drawn from them and rather are possible, feasible, and realizable, and for some must be so. When we ask better for whom, the answer could actually be, well, everybody.
So I'm going to take over here and talk about our research question. And we started with a great quote from China Miéville, which is, "We live in a utopia, it is just not ours." So we do live in a utopian creation, but it's somebody else's creation. These are utopias, but not utopias for the majority of those who live within it. Now, Knapp argues that More's Utopia contains perhaps the first Tudor attempt to elaborate a theory of colonialization. And Kumar also argues that utopianism is integral to the colonial project, that the West's distinctive historical mission, now that it controls, to all intents and purposes, world development, is interlinked with that utopian project and with those canonical utopias. But the utopias of More, of Bacon, of Neville, as just some examples, are colonial. They construct a no place. Would be familiar to international lawyers, the terra nullius, so what's legally deemed to be unoccupied or uninhabited, but often were, or related concepts like res nullius, nobody's thing, or territorium nullius, nobody's land. These often ignore the indigenous populations and often lead to their murder, their enslavement, or the studying and, of course, civilizing of them as part of that international legal project. So law provides those colonial exploits with the legal and sometimes political moral justifications for events that are described in those utopian tracts. So international law supplies the basis for ignoring and indeed causing much harm and violating those indigenous populations, making defined distinctions based on proper land use and creating categories of no place. So if you think of Grotius' major work, which is cited everywhere in international law, most of that, in fact, is advice that he gave to the Dutch East India Company as part of their private corporate colonial project, which was nationalized eventually. But there is no lands. Just as the lands and the seas in these utopian novels were generally inhabited, these were people's places, their homes, their communities, their lives. So in this project, we're looking at those canonical utopias in the justification of colonialism and international law's relationship with that justification. So we're looking at the reception of those texts, their relationship with other travel literature at time. We are trying to trace the connections between the literature, the colonial exploits, and international law. This includes exposing racist, colonialist, white, proto-feminist utopian literature that does fit within this discourse. We also want to look to the apocryphal, so those utopias that are dismissed, and explore the possibilities that lie there for when we think about world building and imagining what world building could look like. So we look to the role of world builders, which is a very common trope in science fiction and fantasy literature, but looking at the international lawyers as those world builders and their shared use of language of colonialism and utopianism. So we will eventually look at the specific projects of utopian projects in international, so the Congresses of Berlin, Vienna, Versailles, the League of Nations and the United Nations, and consider what are considered to be those good utopias and are continuation and substantiations of that white Western genre, and then looking at the celebratory reverence that overlooks those boundaries that were drawn in that context, but also then look at the ones that are dismissed as unfeasible and unrealizable, and some recent 20th century examples being, say, the Bandung Conference or the New International Economic Order. And finally, we will look at what this means for international law scholarship. Now, you could ask, why is this important? Now, utopianism is fairly thinly theorized in international law. There are very famous iterations, Koskiniemi, obviously, and Allott. This, though, and others, such as Razulov's dismissal of utopianism, rely on the canonical work. There was a special edition in the German Yearbook of International Law, which goes beyond this, but that is a rarity in comparison to how it is generally used. So international law's engagement with utopia is not concerned with the fictional. Rather, the narrative is one about the directly political and therefore what's perceived as world building. But this isn't theorized in any meaningful way. The Gentle Civilizer, Koskiniemi's famous work, is in lots of ways a description of a world building exercise. However, this is not put into the context of utopian literature and much of the critique that exists in other disciplines. And international law doesn't hold itself out as a utopian genre, even though it's white male protagonists, very often in the 19th century and perhaps even now, if you look at their pursuits, they are utopian. So the actors sometimes are characterized as utopian, but not the substantive context. And we argue that they're both. So the utopianism comes from both the actors themselves, those international lawyers, as world builders, but also their substantive outcomes. As we've mentioned already, utopias are kind of open for ridicule. They're a dirty word in international law. But this dismisses 2 points: the utopian struggles of those that international law has subjugated. So those subject to colonialism, both men and women, and others, those who are wishing, desiring, and for whom hope is an absolute necessity, which we can learn if we take seriously the interventions from feminist and indigenous and other utopias. It also relies on the canonical utopias for the dismissal, as if they represent the whole. Again, this is a reiteration of problems that exist across law and international law. We then will go on to explore the post-colonial and indigenous utopianism can tell us about the inadequacies of international law, and therefore use utopianism perhaps as a revelatory process. So where do we place the literature? Very obviously within international law, we take a lot of inspiration from third world approaches to international law and the work that Twail has done to expose the colonial nature of international law. We're also looking at law and literature, so we're situating those novels in their context, seeing how they were informed by colonial exploitation, and the contemporaneous justification and legitimization provided by international law. How these experimental texts play out about anxieties over governance themselves, where the real world experience do and do not take place. The obvious parallels between fiction and history in their approaches to race, to gender, and to place, and how these are justified and legitimized. And obviously the work of Edward Said is critically important in that context of understanding hegemonic systems like culture, where we can realize their internal constraints upon writers and thinkers. So obviously it is an interdisciplinary project, and as you said, there's a lot of kind of literary scholarship out there that identifies those tropes. So I mentioned place, time, race, gender, and sexuality. And we've, through our research thus far, we've gathered excerpts from the canonical utopias that are awash with what you call the typical white Western patriarchal tropes. Very often they create a new world, but to do that, you must destroy the old. So you have examples of this in Moore and Herland, for instance. The impossibility often derives from having to persuade people to give up their property. But this, of course, is a persuasion of the white Western male. Indigenous populations are not asked about, how impossible it would be for them, and it was for them to give up their lands. Their blueprints, so uniformity is acquired. So classic blueprint utopias leave no space for those who are constructed as uncivilized or racially inferior. And there's a huge amount about the satisfaction of sexual desires, often not remarked upon in the critique. So this is often about women conforming to male sexual desires, very often as heteronormative, often through sexual enslavement, most often of Indigenous women. And also there's a lot of literature around false modesty or regulation of women's bodies more generally. Now, place is really important. So the term, as Nicola Pose describes it, the term utopia allows for allegorical or allergies. Allegorical, carries with it a spatial dimension. So if you think of Elysium or Shangri-La or the Garden of Eden, and there's of course many others, and these haunted writers and travelers, and about this in the early modern period and into the 18th, 19th centuries, those voyages heading off to find these lands. So Moore's utopia is reliant on a premise of emptiness, but not terra nullius. It's empty because the Indigenous people are not counted. Of course, the most famous example probably of that is within the US's Constitution, counting African Americans as 2/3 of a person. So it's not fully a person. And also the Melbourne International Law School, there's a lot of work there on Australia and the Aboriginal population there, and that same construction of emptiness by dismissing or not counting the people are there. It's no place often because the native inhabitants have been destroyed or taken away or enslaved and no longer counted. And often women in that group become the silent group that are there just to satisfy the sexual needs of men. But it comes in many forms. So if you look at Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, so Defoe was a Puritan. He was in favor of the slave trade, of child labor. He was homophobic. He was misogynist. But if you look at a lot of the descriptions of Robinson Crusoe's utopian, he's kind of described as this imaginative genius. But what he does on the island is he reinvents Western agriculture and industry on the island and moves more and more away from being a hunter-gatherer because he's civilizing it, right? And then when he gets home, all his wealth is waiting for him that he has gained through empire. In Voltaire's Candide, which itself is a satire of optimism, they go to El Dorado, and it's about how the locals don't appreciate all the gold they have, that they don't see what they have, and they're only praised when their infrastructure starts looking like it's European. And there's so there's a lot of how the place is construed, how the land is construed, how you count the people there. Lots of issues of scale and place and emptiness are creating the false creation of emptiness. Time and history is also very important. So the history and the future, often utopianism is critiqued as futurity, but there's lots of examples in utopian literature of a much more complex relationship with the past and the future, and with dystopia and nostalgic pasts. So there's a lot of utopian songs, for instance, written about better lives, and often these are reflective of the class that these utopias come out of. So immigrant songs about going for a better life and creating their identity. Obviously, the United States with a lot of examples of that, but also New Zealand. Or a future where there is no slavery. So if you look, But these can be also quite negative. So in John Aldous' Etzler's Within the Reach of All Men, there is no slavery in the future because it's all been replaced by science, and you've basically moved the African American population elsewhere. So it's the future, that it's not always positive. They can also be about the horrors of the present life. So if you think of the slave spirituals, slave songs of the US South, dreams of escape, of hope or change. South African utopian literature during the apartheid era often comes in this form, but also can be about reclaiming the past. And these are often found in rebellions, often against colonialism. So if you look at Celtic mysticism, so a romanticization of your past to recreate a utopian dream of your future. And you also find this in traditions in Australia, amongst First Nations, amongst Maori, and ghost dance movements in the United States as well. Another example would perhaps be the new Australian Feminist Judgments Project. So I think Feminist Judgment Project could generally be described as a form of utopian writing, but they are the news project is entirely written by Aboriginal peoples as a form of writing of reimagining what it could be in Australia if colonialism hadn't come in and completely upended and destroyed and eliminated the justice system. Gender and sexuality are entirely interconnected here. So in Henry Neville's Isle of the Pines, there's a single a black woman in it, and her sexuality, her intelligence, what she looked like are in contrast to the white characters as a key theme throughout it. In the history of the Sevarbians, again, this is Australia. Australia tends to feature a lot in this kind of element. There's sexual slavery of the indigenous people is just characterized as quite natural. In Voyage Around the World, the Comte de Bougainville, it's very much about the women living on Haiti, their bodies, about ideas of innocent stealing, about blaming the British for the arrival of the venereal diseases, but also that local laws are tyrannical. It's and even one, say, like James Lawrence's Empire of the Nares, in a call where he calls it a paradise for mothers, this is very, very, very loosely based on the Nair Hindu caste. And you know, it doesn't reflect those women's actual lived experiences. It's all, of course, very much linked to Spivak's work about the subaltern woman and silences, and also about women being saved from brown men by white men. And you can see this play out in an awful lot of these. In actually that Faber collection of utopias include the Marquis de Sade, which is an interesting idea that is a utopia. Also, they tend to all be heteronormative to a huge degree, and whether or not homosexuality is outwardly condemned, certainly there is considered to be a right way of being sexual, and it is very much heteronormative in male. This is very different from the feminist utopias of the 60s and 70s, particularly works like The Left Hand of Darkness, but also, of course, doesn't represent those places that were being colonized. So like the monks of Mexico, or the Hijra in India, where the British Raj attempted to completely eliminate them. So there is a recreation of a very particular type. There's also race, of course, crosses a huge amount of them. One curiosity is that everyone gets described as Scythians, so the Irish are Scythians, but people in the South Seas are also the Scythians. Everyone's a Scythian, which is it's an interesting one, that a race that is othered, that is then brought in everywhere. Often things are constructed as scientific. So if you look at Francis Bacon, again, Robinson Crusoe, the Comte de Bougainville, Dickens, the use of phrenology and eugenics, especially in the 19th century. There's the construction of science and the science of race, and the science, why people, for instance, in Dickens, The Noble Savage, why basically the savages should be left to live where they are and we shouldn't try to improve them at all because that's scientifically who they are. So it also meant that things weren't recognized, so forms of Swidian agriculture were dismissed, and rather it was suggested that the indigenous populations were just not using the land. And even something like Margaret Mead's description of Samoan women, they are being scientifically written about, and it's completely inaccurate. Now, in that context, it was the women themselves lying to Margaret Mead, but at the same time, they're being written about, and their lives is this sort of utopian life is created for them. There's also, of course, proto-feminist ones. Elizabeth Cavendish's The Blazing World, which is regarded by many as the first science fiction book, is almost entirely really about empire and violence. Elizabeth Barragon Corbett's book, New Amazonia, is built on the destruction of the indigenous population, which is curious in that it's supposed to be a feminist utopia, and it's actually set in Ireland, but you kill all the Irish women, so they don't get to live in their feminist utopia. But also something like Elizabeth Wollstonecraft's Women Free, which focuses on the violence that's perpetuated against women and how this has led to women's bodies being the way they are. So I'll pass back to Ruth.
Yeah, so what are the remaining questions from that we are now to go on to explore? So we've talked a bit about the way in which we want to analyse the canonical utopian texts, but we also then will move on to look at the apocryphal utopias. So what utopias were submerged, what are erased, which are forgotten. And to inform our study of those utopias, we'll again be building on literary scholarship that explores these non-Western utopias. In literary theory, there's been this argument that because utopianism is a Western genre, and we see that through the presentation of a canon, that these other utopias don't exist. And yet, actually, we can see from works in literary scholarship that that's just not true. So while some argue that utopias are Western because they emerged from Christianity, and that all non-Western utopias there emerge from the contact with the West, scholars are now disagreeing with those theories. What we can then learn from those apocryphal utopias, we want to explore what post-colonial and indigenous utopianism can tell us about the inadequacies of international law, and how we can see utopianism then as a revelatory process. So this project is going to reflect on what that means for international legal scholarship. We'll have to problematize futurity. So what does international law do with the past, whether that's state practice or treaty interpretation, and how we conceptualize progress as international lawyers will have to be questioned when we look at apocryphal utopias and what they do with time, what they do with the past, present, and future. There's also a problematization of language. So we see in scholarship on indigenous utopias an evaluation of what they're called trickster language, so to disconnect and break from the colonial frameworks. And this might be a useful and productive way of thinking about critiquing international law. And we argue that utopianism might be a way of seeing through these different ways in which international law has constructed place. Just as one example. We're really interested in particular through the different forms that these utopian ideas can take. So not just texts, but maybe through song, through plays, through leaflets, and other different forms, what that can also tell us about how we should investigate international law. And the use of violence, Aoife has discussed that for a number of the examples that we've talked about, what that use of violence and its justification, how that might play out in a conversation about international law. So the three categories that we have left to explore are our canonical international lawyers, so the way in which they engaged in kind of world-building projects, where we might think about the work that Aoife has already done on the language in textbooks, and the way in which they might be using utopian ideas and utopian language. And we consider the audience of those books. Who were they trying to persuade? Who was that international law audience? The fourth category, the apocryphal utopias as kind of events. So those attempts that are often dismissed as utopian, dismissed as unfeasible, impossible, unrealizable because they are utopian, such as the new international economic order and the WTO riots in Seattle. That's our fourth category to go on to look at. And then the fifth category is the canonical utopian events that are celebrated. Often celebrated without interrogating what those events might mean. So whether it's the Congress of Vienna being declared as utopian, or other congresses such as the Congress of Berlin and how the Congo was described, looking back at the ways in which they, those utopian moments actually constructed out certain voices. So by looking at international law texts as world building, or looking at these specific events as being a canonical utopian, or indeed an apocryphal utopian and therefore constructed out, we can question the Western international lawyers' use of utopians to build their worlds and the way in which they are then dismissive or mocking of others. The global south then has had to throw off, if you like, the global north's utopian dreams. Colonialism has robbed many utopian politics that we now as scholars might dismiss, and we would like to take seriously their interventions and how utopianism might actually be reclaimed as political activism. So finally, how would we like people to engage with the project? Well, in this time of lockdown that we're in, our article that's published in Global Constitutionalism might act as a handy reading list if you were looking for some science fiction reading. So we talked about the novels that we use there, but it might just be a handy reading list if you're looking for things to look into. The second is that obviously we're at the start of this project now, going on to look at what we've called apocryphal utopias, those that are hidden or ignored. And so if there are things that we should be reading, ones that you already know of or have come across, and we will of course acknowledge you appropriately, as well as doing our own searches, then do get in touch. This project on colonialism, international law and utopia forms part of a broader project of reconceptualizing utopia for international law, which we are part of with Catherine McNally and Matthew Nicholson. So if you too are working on utopianism, or you're interested in how utopia might intersect with international law, then you can get in touch with us on Twitter. So my handle is @Ruth_Houghton and Aoife's is @AoifeMOD. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.